Ladies and gentlemen, today we have a massive controversy shaking the MMA world. Undefeated UFC flyweight Jeff Molina has been slapped with a 3-year retroactive suspension by the Nevada Athletic Commission for his involvement in a betting scandal. But here's where things get really interesting. Molina isn't staying silent. He's fighting back, questioning the UFC's fairness and even drawing comparisons to none other than Conor McGregor. Now, let's break this down because this is bigger than just one fighter getting punished. This story raises serious questions about how the UFC handles betting violations, potential double standards, and what this means for fighters moving forward. Jeff Molina's suspension. What actually happened? So, Jeff Molina, an undefeated flyweight, was caught up in a betting controversy that resulted in the Nevada Athletic Commission handing him a 3-year retroactive suspension. Now, what does retroactive mean here? It means the suspension started back when the investigation began, so he won't actually be out for another full 3 years from today. That's important. Molina's involvement in betting wasn't just some small mistake. It's tied to the James Krause betting scandal, which shook the MMA world. Krause, a former fighter and coach, was allegedly involved in insider betting, meaning he was using confidential fighter information to place bets. The UFC responded aggressively, banning Krause and cutting ties with fighters associated with him, including Molina. Molina was suspended because he continued betting even after the UFC officially warned fighters to stop. That's a huge deal. The UFC made it clear fighters and coaches are banned from betting on UFC fights. But Molina, knowingly or unknowingly, didn't follow that rule. Now, here's where things get really controversial. Molina is defending himself, saying his bets were minor, not some massive scheme. He claims he wasn't involved in anything like match fixing or illegal insider betting. But the Nevada Commission didn't care. A rule is a rule. 3 years, done? The Conor McGregor comparison, is there a double standard? Now, this is where Molina's argument gets really spicy. He's pointing fingers at the UFC and asking why he's being punished so harshly when Conor McGregor openly places bets on fights. If you follow Conor on social media, you've seen it. He publicly shares his betting slips, boasts about his predictions, and sometimes even bets on fights involving his teammates. So, if Conor is allowed to do this, why not Molina? Molina is suggesting that there's a double standard, that if you're a massive superstar like McGregor, you can get away with things that a lesser-known fighter cannot. And honestly, he's got a point. Think about it, Conor McGregor is the UFC's biggest cash cow. He brings in massive pay-per-view buys, sells out arenas, and generates more revenue than almost any other fighter. If the UFC were to punish him for betting the way they punished Molina, they'd risk losing one of their biggest moneymakers. Now, to be fair, there's a key difference here. McGregor isn't currently an active fighter. Right now, he's not competing, so technically the rules that apply to fighters betting on their own sport may not apply to him in the same way. But here's the issue, McGregor has fought while actively betting and no action was ever taken. That's what Molina is pointing at. So, the question is the UFC truly fair in how they enforce their betting policies? Or do they pick and choose based on the fighter's value to the company? The UFC's bigger problem, betting scandals, are becoming a trend. Let's zoom out for a second. Jeff Molina's case isn't the first UFC betting scandal. Over the past few years, we've seen James Krause's entire career collapse because of his alleged betting involvement. Darrick Minner being released for suspicious betting activity before his fight. Fighters raising concerns about insider information leaking. The UFC has a serious integrity problem when it comes to gambling. Betting on MMA has exploded in popularity, and with millions of dollars being wagered on fights, the risk of corruption increases. This is why Molina's case is so important. If the UFC isn't consistent with its punishments, fighters will lose faith in the system. If some guys get banned while others get a free pass, it creates a culture where rules don't really matter, only your value to the company does. What happens next? Will Molina fight again? Now, Molina's suspension is 3 years retroactive, meaning he could be back in action sooner than later. But let's be real, this scandal has already damaged his career. The UFC cut ties with James Krause, which means Molina might struggle to find a top-tier gym. Will another major MMA promotion even want to sign him with this controversy hanging over him? But here's another twist, Molina is still young. 3 years is a long time, but it's not a career ender. If he stays in shape, trains, and waits for the suspension to expire, we could still see him return to the UFC. The real question is, will the UFC want him back? Because let's be honest, if Jeff Molina was a superstar, the UFC might have fought to keep him. If this were someone like Sean O'Malley or Paddy Pimblett, would they have been punished the same way? It's a brutal truth in MMA, some fighters are expendable and some are protected. And Molina is calling that out. Final thoughts, is Molina right to call out the UFC? At the end of the day, this controversy isn't just about Jeff Molina. It's about how the UFC handles its fighters, how they enforce their own rules, and whether or not the system is fair. Molina made a mistake, no doubt about that. Betting when you're told not to? That's on him. But the question is the punishment fair? And why does Conor McGregor get away with things that other fighters can't? The UFC needs to address this, or else this betting scandal won't be the last. And speaking of scandals in the MMA world, there's another controversy brewing, a massive shakeup in the UFC rankings that has fans furious. Who got unfairly dropped, who moved up without deserving it, and is this proof that the UFC manipulates rankings to favor certain fighters? Let's break that down next. UFC rankings controversy. Are the rankings rigged? Alright, fight fans, let's shift gears because we have another major controversy brewing in the UFC. And this time, it's about something that directly affects fighters' careers. The UFC rankings. Recently, there's been a massive shakeup in the rankings, and fans are absolutely furious. Fighters are getting dropped for no reason, others are skyrocketing up without earning it, and it's raising serious questions. Are the UFC rankings rigged? Now, here's something you need to understand. UFC rankings are not official. They're determined by a panel of media members, and the UFC itself does not control them directly. But let's be real, we all know how the game works. The UFC has massive influence over who gets pushed up the rankings and who gets held back. And the latest changes have fans calling foul. The biggest UFC rankings controversies right now. 1. Fighters moving up without fighting. This one happens all the time. A fighter doesn't even compete, yet they mysteriously move up a spot or two. How does that happen? It's clear the rankings are not purely based on merit. Sometimes, if a more marketable fighter is in position for a big fight, the rankings mysteriously shift to help build hype. 2. Undeserved drops. Fighters who are inactive for a short time suddenly get kicked down the rankings, while others, who haven't fought in even longer, stay put. Some fighters get punished for losses that don't even make sense, while others get gifted a better ranking even after losing. 3. Favoritism towards certain fighters. Let's be real. If you're a big name, the UFC wants you ranked high. Some fighters get pushed up faster because the UFC wants to set up big fights. Meanwhile, others who have been grinding, winning fights, and proving themselves get ignored because they aren't as marketable. Is the UFC controlling the rankings? Now, the UFC officially denies that they control the rankings, but let's be honest, we've seen too many suspicious moves over the years. Dana White has openly admitted in interviews that he can influence matchmaking. And we know that rankings impact title shots, contracts, and pay. And the worst part? Fighters have no control over this. They can dominate their opponents, go on winning streaks, and still get held back in the rankings simply because they aren't a big enough name. More and more fighters are starting to call out the ranking system, saying it's unfair and manipulated. And honestly, they have every right to. At the end of the day, the UFC is a business, and rankings aren't just about skill, they're about what makes money. And as long as the UFC can influence them, we're going to keep seeing controversial decisions that leave fans and fighters frustrated. Now, speaking of unfair treatment in the UFC, there's another situation unfolding right now that could change how fighters negotiate contracts forever. A major UFC star is fighting back against the company, demanding better pay, more freedom, and a contract that doesn't lock them down. Could this be the start of a fighter revolution? Let's get into it.